point is that Iran has threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz at multiple points in time in the past, but Iran has never done it for several reasons. But most of all, what matters now, when Iran is, well, largely starved of allies that come out in active military support of Tehran, at this point in time, if Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz, it will in effect be tantamount to a declaration of war, not just against Israel, but across most of its neighboring states, because oil trade relies disproportionately on this particular strait compared to any other such choke point in the world, and Iran knows this.
Israel is currently in the process of striking the Iranian capital of Tehran with a focus on the headquarters of the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. This comes after a bout of strikes by US B-2 bombers on Iranian nuclear facilities, 3 major Iranian nuclear facilities on Saturday night. Trump has claimed that the nuclear facilities were totally obliterated during the attack, in what he has termed a spectacular military success. Iran, on the other hand, has not confirmed the extent of the damage. Here to chat with me about what the developing situation might mean for India is Bashir Abbas. Bashir is a senior research associate at CSDR, the Council for Strategic Defense Research in New Delhi. He was also previously a fellow at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C., and he is a regular contributor to the Indian Express. Thank you so much for joining us, Bashir.
My pleasure to speak to you.
My first question for you is, what has India's response thus far been to Trump's attack on Iran, and what do you see as the direct implications of these attacks for New Delhi going forward?
Right. So I think India's initial response, and its only response thus far, was already formulated in a statement that the Ministry of External Affairs released after Israel began its attacks on Iran on June 13th. The Indian position is very balanced. It is very neutral. It avoids any condemnations of any state whatsoever and sticks to calling for effectively a cessation of hostilities and a resumption of negotiations and the path to peace, if you will. But it is a very careful and safe position. At one level, it is very easily understood, since unlike Israel's conflicts so far, conflicts for the lack of a better word, with Lebanon, with Syria, with Yemen, and in Gaza, where most of its actions bear the characteristics of genocide, according to multiple reports. But in all of these contexts, India did not really have any substantial stake that is immediately threatened because of the Israeli action, while long-term instability in the region is obviously detrimental to India's interests. But when it comes to Iran, it's very evident that with Iran, we have a single issue focused partnership, but an important one, which is the Chabahar port. And I don't need to get into it. I think by now everyone's aware. And with Israel, the thrust of the relationship is our defense partnership with Israel and how much that has grown by leaps and bounds, really, in the last few years. So in that context, India's stance is well understood and it remains so. What's only interesting is that once the SCO came out with its own statement, which was significantly more assertive and critical of the Israeli action, I think India proactively distanced itself from the SCO statement. But I would be careful when analyzing India's sort of separation from its own position from the SCO, because India's rationale was not so much vis-a-vis the substance of the SCO statement. India's rationale was that India was not part of the consultations that SCO members made before drafting this statement, right? So it's a question of India's agency whether or not to sign on to any statement regardless of what the statement says, right? So I think that is something that India has made clear. Now, the implications of the US strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities, India has officially not taken a position on this so far, but it is reasonable to assume that India's position remains the same, which is a call for return to negotiations and inclusive resolutions of all conflicts in the region. I think in the Indian strategic mind, that itself is vast enough to encompass all of the issues in the region, because at the end of the day, a mediated solution using only actors in the region is what India supports. India also does not support any solution that has any association with any externally imposed conditions, including that by the International Court of Justice, which is why India also abstained in the most recent UNGA resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. Now, India's abstention on Gaza has been criticized both at home and abroad because India is standing distinct from the global south. But India has a technically consistent position. I'm sure you'll remember that in November, when we first abstained, we changed our position in December, right? So a lot of people are focused on our acceptance of that December 2023 resolution and then questioning why we abstain now. But that December resolution had no references to the ICJ, but this resolution very much did. So regardless of what India's position, again, on the substance of the conflict, this consistency demands that India stick to its older position. The question that's really being asked now is that technical consistency more valuable to India than India being aligned with the global south, especially since it aspires towards global south leadership? Now, that question is still up in the air and it's an active debate as far as I'm aware. But in the grand scheme of things, I think such a dent in the rules based international order, but specifically against the inviolable safety of nuclear power plants anywhere in the world, is something that will concern any state anywhere, especially India, which has had its own peculiar journey from starting a nuclear program that was very civilian and energy focused, which was then eventually turned into a weapons program by virtue of necessity and activities on both the Pakistani and the Chinese fronts. But since then, the one thing that India has always consistently stood by is the sanctity of nuclear installations. So there is a lot of concern in New Delhi about what this means or what sort of a precedent this sets, including from strategic experts in India. Even though this is not formulated officially by the Ministry of External Affairs, that concern has been heightened. And one thing that India and Pakistan have, which is again very distinct from the rest of the world, is a non-attack agreement against each other's nuclear facilities. And this has been active since 1991. Both countries, despite their hostilities waxing and waning, have sort of religiously adhered to the practice of exchanging the lists of nuclear installations in each other's countries so that they are not attacked, especially during times of war. I think that is where Indian concerns presently lie, but I'll stop there.
Many have spoken of Israel's attack on Iran as a potential geopolitical blow for India in terms of potential future damage to the Haifa port, which is an Adani project in Israel, potential closure of the Strait of Hormuz, which would obviously result in trade disruption, economic disruption for India, and potential, again, disruption to the IMEC project, which is the India-Middle East Economic Corridor. To what extent do you think that regional instability could have the potential to disadvantage India?
So there are three things here, right? And I'll take them one after the other. The first is the facts on the ground, and then you get to the Indian reaction or implications for India, right? At one level, thus far, we haven't seen any substantial impact on Indian projects directly, either in Iran or in Israel. Okay. In fact, while Iran has and this is verified by multiple reports around the world, that Iran has struck multiple targets in Haifa. However, the Adani Group, which has a stake in the Haifa port, has come out with its own statement saying that its own interests are safe. Now, any bomb damage assessment from what Israel has done or Iran has done all the way since June 13th is still yet to come that can allow us to form a very credible and conclusive opinion. So that having been said, thus far these concerns have not been raised, right? Second, the point about the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Now, I think the Strait of Hormuz is so significant, I mean, carrying 1/5 of the world's LNG amidst a lot of other variables. Even the Iranian threat to close it is bad enough to send markets into a tizzy. And that has happened. But what is also true is that the Iranians have consistently, in the last 2 decades, several times made the threat to close the strait, right? But Iranian capability to do this sustainably is in question. And second, Iranian intention to do this is also in question, because the point is that Iran has threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz at multiple points in time in the past, but Iran has never done it for several reasons. But most of all, what matters now, when Iran is, well, largely starved of allies that come out in active military support of Tehran, At this point in time, if Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz, it will in effect be tantamount to a declaration of war, not just against Israel, but across most of its neighboring states, because oil trade relies disproportionately on this particular strait compared to any other such choke point in the world, and Iran knows this. More importantly, Iran's own oil sales to China also depend on the strait. Now, you could argue that Iran could allow its own ships to pass, or at least Chinese vessels to pass, when carrying oil to Beijing, but since Iran closed the strait, you can 100% expect military action from other states in the region, but especially so from the United States. And that's why it doesn't guarantee the security of even tankers going to China. Right. So at the end of the day, it's more of a burning the house down, desperate call that Iran has never made in the past. And I would argue even now, Iran is unlikely to do this. The report about the Iranian parliament voting to do this is a little obfuscatory because the Iranian parliament hasn't voted on it. There was no such bill introduced. There's only a consensus to recommend this action to the Supreme National Security Council, which will take the ultimate call. But as I said earlier, the threat to do it is bad enough. I think the Indian concern vis-a-vis the potential closure of the Strait of Hormuz is already been formulated by our Energy Minister Hardeep Singh Puri, when the minister stated that this is why India focused on diversifying its energy sources, right? Especially a larger import of Russian oil. Now, you could argue that that is also under threat, especially given Lindsey Graham's statements today morning that if there are greater US sanctions on Russian oil, then perhaps it puts our energy mix into some jeopardy. But there will be entering the realm of speculation, right? Because a lot of these things haven't happened yet, right? If it does happen, it's not just India. I don't think any other state in the world is sort of prepared to really tackle the outcomes of Iran potentially closing the strait. But I've already given you the rationale as to why that's unlikely. It could change. We live in times where any such rational analysis can easily be thrown out the window. So they might still do it. The last point, however, is about the IMEC. When India announced the India Middle East Europe corridor, in September 2023, in less than a month, you had the Hamas terror attack on Israel, right? The fact that the Israeli action has been so disproportionate as to completely put in jeopardy its potential cooperation with the Arab states on this project has already put a big question mark on the viability of this project in the short term, right? And this is specifically because you have multiple points on the route of the corridor, but specifically the Israel-Jordan border, which is key to the whole situation, to the whole project, right? You will not have a Middle East Europe connect if this part of the border doesn't open up. And the way the things are going currently, it is unlikely that you will have the degree of stability that you need for a flourishing trade corridor along this very ambitious route. Even in the best of times, in September itself, before the Middle East erupted again in conflict, you had enough naysayers pointing out the numerous logistical hurdles on this route, especially the rail connectivity across the Arabian Peninsula, and the whole economic logic of it all, because the number of TEUs that you can pass on through just solely shipborne trade is still more efficient than any ship route that you might envision, right? So you always had questions. I would argue that in the last 18 months, those questions have only increased even further. So much so that the Egyptians are now proposing that you reroute the corridor and instead of bypassing the Suez Canal, which they are very concerned about, why don't you co-opt Egypt as another partner, right? So when it comes to the IMEC, the development is the lack of developments, right? We still haven't had the stakeholder meetings that were supposed to happen when the program was announced. So I think until and unless you have at least these meetings to reconcile the policy positions of all of these states, and only then can you start talking about the material viability of the project, regardless of whether the conflict between Israel and Iran or Iran and the United States escalates or does not, right? Thus far, India's focus vis-a-vis the IMEC has been to push the part of the corridor that it can push, which is between India and the Middle Eastern states, and specifically between the UAE and Saudi Arabia. That is somewhere that India is focused. And if you look at the statements of our foreign minister in the last few months, across the last year entirely, whenever he's asked a question about the IMEC, his yardstick of success has always been, we are doing this X, Y, and Z with Saudi Arabia and with the UAE, because that for us is the benchmark of progress. Privately, and this has been reported by multiple outlets in India, including the Hindu, that privately a lot of the officials will admit that at this stage, we are waiting for things to settle down in the Middle East. Until then, there is very little that India can do, right? I think that's where we are.